In this chapter, we'll take a look at how we can create a photorealistic rendering in SketchUp using a plugin called Podium. It's important to note that Podium is not a free plugin. You can download a trial version of it, however, it is relatively inexpensive. With Podium installed as a plugin, go to Tool Palettes and select Podium from the dropdown. Whenever you create any photorealistic rendering, you need geometry, reflections, and lighting. In this section, we'll take a look at lighting. Podium offers a great browser library where they have light fixtures that are already preset with lighting values. So we'll just browse through here till we find a light that we like. I like this one here. And another one we'll grab is just this one here. And again, what's great about these is not only is the geometry really well created, but it also has illumination within the lighting component itself. This saves a lot of time from having to render, readjust the rendering, and see if the lighting works. Just going to rotate the light, and we'll set it in place. Looks pretty good there. Sometimes the scale will be off a little bit for what you need, and that's okay. You may need to right-click and unglue the component, and then you can move this up. And we'll just move this down a little bit. Looks pretty good. Aside from adding lighting fixtures, you can also use the sunlight. However, our sunlight's going to be pretty limited since this is a north-facing facade. To compensate for that, we'll take the rectangle tool and draw a face here. We'll then take the paint bucket, select a light yellow tint, and apply that as a texture on this surface. Next, in the materials properties of Podium, we want to select this material and make it a light power. And we'll set this for a light power of 10. We also want to make this hidden, and then click Apply. Now the rendering we want to do is from the staircase, and we don't want to see the Google Earth imagery. So go into Layers, and just turn those off. You can then right-click and update that scene. And now we can move on and add reflections to certain textures within the model. In this video, we're going to take a look at how you can add reflections and bump to existing textures with Podium. Now, before we do that, if you don't have the Podium browser, that's okay. Open up this file in the working files called podium.skp. And that way we're working from the same view and the same position of the lighting elements that we put in the model from our previous exercise. To add reflections to textures within Podium, you first need to click on the material properties. You can then click on the eyedropper and click on any texture within the model. So for the wood texture, let's set this reflection to 15 and let's make it a blurred reflection. Simply click Apply and click on the rug. Let's take a look at some of the presets and settings for Podium. First, just click on the gear, and you have various different options for Podium. You can set the image size, you can set where you want to save the actual rendering, as well as the format. You also have these different presets that allow different lighting, for example, for an interior or exterior rendering. Now, one last thing before we can render in Podium, let's go to Shadows and turn on the shadows. And lastly, just click the first icon here in the Podium toolbar, and that'll start the rendering process. It's going to begin processing the geometry, and it's also going to bring up this OOPR, which is essentially the rendering manager, where you can see any renderings that you have in the queue. You can also click Show, and that'll show you a preview of the rendering. Now, we can't preview it just yet because it does have to process all of the geometry. The time to process all the geometry really depends on how many faces you have in your model. And a key point here is if you're doing an image or rendering like this, you may want to save a separate file with just all the geometry in here, and you can delete geometry like things in the dining room or things in the kitchen, because right now it's actually reading those faces, however you don't see them in the model. So once it processes all the geometry, you can then open up the OOPR. You can then click Show, and it'll begin by gathering all of the lighting. It'll then pre-render the image. In this video, we're going to do a similar process as we did in the last chapter, where we created a composite rendering in Photoshop. Let's first take the rendering that we created in Podium and have it as our bottom layer. We then have two other files called the Podium Sketch and Podium Back Edges that will stack in here. Let's set the back edges to multiply for the blending, as well as the sketch we'll set to multiply. Now again, the image is really dark, so click on the layer of the Podium rendering and go to Levels to adjust the levels. We're going to bring the white up. We're going to move the middle bar up as well. This starts to wash out the rendering, so bring the black down to add more contrast. You may need to bring that gray over a little bit. Bring the white up a little bit more. The other things we can do is bring down the opacity for the sketch, as well as bring down the opacity for the back edges. In the back edges, it's a little distracting, but let's take the eraser and just erase those elements there along the couch. It looks pretty good. Last thing you do is just save this, and you have yourself a nice little rendering. That concludes this chapter. We'll move on to the last and final chapter. We'll bring all this together where we can present our model using a separate program from SketchUp called Layout. Layout is the paper space for your SketchUp model and allows you to create construction documents as well as presentations.